There is a photograph on the wall of my mother's house. She refuses to take it down, even now, even after everything, that shows me on my wedding day. I am standing at the altar of St. Catherine's Church, in a dark navy suit I'd had tailored specifically for that Saturday in June, and my face holds an expression I have never managed to replicate since: open, unguarded, radiantly certain. The expression of a man who believes, with his whole architecture, that the best thing that will ever happen to him is happening right now. The photographer caught me at the precise moment Elena walked through the double doors at the back of the church. You can see it in my eyes, the way they land on her and simply stop moving. She was wearing ivory lace with a low back, and she carried white garden roses, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I knew it and she knew it and the 112 people in that church knew it. That photograph is still on my mother's wall. What is not in the photograph, what no photograph from that day captured, because it happened during cocktail hour while I was being pulled from guest to guest by my best man Craig, executing the social choreography of a wedding reception, is Elena kissing someone in the garden. I didn't know about it then. I didn't know about it for 3 years. My name is Thomas Hale. I was 29 on my wedding day and 32 when I found out. I am a secondary school history teacher, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life explaining to 16-year-olds that events which seem inevitable in retrospect were not inevitable at all, that at every point in history, different choices were available. I have thought about the irony of this frequently. Elena and I had met at university. She was studying architecture, I was studying history, and we collided at a mutual friend's birthday at a bar that no longer exists, on a November evening so cold that everyone inside had the flushed, relieved look of people who'd survived something. She was funny and precise and she argued with elegance and she laughed with her whole face. We dated for 4 years before I proposed. We were engaged for 18 months. 6.5 years of building a life, a vocabulary, a shorthand, a set of shared assumptions about who we were and what we were doing together. And on the day we stood in St. Catherine's and promised everything, she was already keeping something from me. Or rather, she would tell me, years later, that what happened that day in the garden was not planned. That it was a moment of terrible weakness at the worst possible time. That she had been trying to end something that she hadn't adequately ended, and that ending it the wrong way, on that day, was the most shameful thing she had ever done. I believed her. I hated believing her, but I believed her. I should tell you how I found out. It was a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years into our marriage. Lily, not our Lily, another one, a colleague of Elena's, had sent Elena a message that was meant for someone else. I know this because Elena told me so, later, and because the message made no sense as something directed at Elena. It was short: he told Thomas at the Marchetti dinner. Did you know? Elena left the room with the phone pressed to her chest. She stood in the hallway for a long time. Then she came back in, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and said, "I need to tell you something about our wedding day." The opening of this story operates on a temporal dislocation that is itself a psychological portrait. Thomas presents the wedding photograph, the moment of maximum certainty, maximum openness, and then immediately contaminates it with what he now knows. This is the experience of retroactive betrayal. The past is not simply past, it is retroactively recolored by the revelation. Every memory becomes a potential site of concealment. The photograph that his mother keeps on the wall is no longer simply a record of a happy day, it is evidence of how completely a person can be deceived at the moment they believe themselves most fully known. What distinguishes this story's setup from a conventional infidelity narrative is its scale of temporal irony. The betrayal happened on the wedding day itself. There is perhaps no more psychologically devastating timing. A wedding is, by definition, a public declaration of exclusive commitment, and to violate that commitment on the very day it is being declared transforms the ceremony from a beginning into a kind of retroactive lie. Thomas's profession, history teacher, expert in contingency, becomes its own bitter irony. He teaches that nothing was inevitable. And yet when his own history is rewritten, the revision feels total, as if nothing else could ever have been true. Our marriage, in its first 3 years, was, I want to be precise about this, genuinely good. Not perfect. Not the effortless idol that people perform on social media. But good in the ways that matter. We were honest with each other, mostly. We were kind to each other, mostly. We argued about real things rather than about the surface of things, and when we argued toward something, toward understanding, or resolution, or at least the honest acknowledgement of a disagreement that wasn't going to be resolved. Elena was a junior architect at a firm called Saterholm & K, one of the mid-sized firms doing interesting residential work in the city. She was passionate about her work in the specific way that makes a person good at it. She thought about buildings the way other people think about music, as systems with emotional resonances, and she talked about them that way, and I found this quality of mind one of the things I loved most about her. When she walked through a building, she would slow down at structural details that other people walked past. She noticed things. We had moved into a flat near the canal in our first year, a second-floor place with high ceilings and bad plumbing that we painted in colors we argued about and loved, eventually, together. We acquired furniture piece by piece, the way young married people do, each item carrying a small story. We had a dining table we'd argued about for 3 weekends running and now ate every dinner at. We had a sofa that was wrong for the space and exactly right for lying on together. I should describe the first signs. They were subtle enough that I would not have recognized them as signs at all without the retrospective clarity that only arrives when you already know the answer. Elena had a friend named Dominic. Dominic Osei was an architect too. They'd worked together briefly at her previous firm before she moved to Saterholm & K. They remained friends in the easy, uncomplicated way that colleagues become friends: occasional drinks, an annual catch-up dinner, the occasional text about something in the professional world they shared. I had met him 4 or 5 times. He was personable and considered and spoke carefully, the kind of person who listens before responding. I had no particular feelings about him. But I noticed, or rather I noticed in retrospect, having thought about this many times since, that Elena's behavior around mentions of Dominic had a specific quality. Not nervous exactly. Careful. The same carefulness I would later recognize in Daniel Marsh's account of his wife's phone habits, had I known Daniel Marsh. The carefulness of someone managing information. She mentioned Dominic in the same breath as other names, always embedded in a group, Dominic and Priya and the others from the old firm, as if he were never singular. When his name came up it moved quickly, transitionally, like a car changing lanes without indicating. There were other things, smaller. A night out with colleagues, in our second year, that she came home from later than expected, slightly flushed in a way that could easily be explained by wine and a later tube. A work trip to Bristol, 2 nights, for a site consultation, that she mentioned having mixed feelings about and then didn't discuss afterward. A Saturday afternoon in our third year where she took a phone call in the bedroom and came out 20 minutes later with the composed, neutral expression of someone who has just reorganized their face. Each of these things, isolated, was nothing. I took them as nothing. I was busy that year. It was my first year as head of the history department, a promotion that had arrived with considerable administrative weight and considerable satisfaction, and my attention was not surplus. I was tired and engaged and largely content, and contentment, I've come to believe, is one of the most effective forms of blindness available. There was one moment, though. It was at a party, someone's birthday, a friend of Elena's from university, a gathering in a garden in late August that had the warm, frictionless quality of a summer evening among people who all like each other. Elena and I had arrived together and almost immediately dispersed in the way that comfortable couples do at parties, trusting each other to navigate independently and reconvene. I had been talking to a man named Fred, something to do with urban planning, I can't remember the specifics, when I looked across the garden and saw Elena talking to Dominic. He had come with someone I didn't recognize, a woman who was standing slightly apart, looking at her phone. Elena and Dominic were in the middle of a conversation that had the quality of a private conversation happening in a public setting, close, low-voiced, the kind of proximity you don't perform for an audience. As I watched, Elena said something, and Dominic looked away from her for a moment and nodded, and something passed between them in that nod, an agreement, a recognition, something that had the texture of shared weight. I looked away. I talked to Fred about urban planning for 3 more minutes and then went and got another drink and found someone else to talk to. I did not go over to Elena and Dominic. I have thought about why. I think the honest answer is that I didn't go over because some part of me had registered the quality of that nod and preferred not to be standing close enough to understand it better. The evening ended well. We walked home along the canal in the warm dark, and Elena held my arm, and we talked about the party the way you talk about parties, who was funny, what had happened, what someone had said about someone else. She was warm and close and present. I said nothing about Dominic. She didn't mention him either. What is notable about this section is what it withholds. There is no point of no return here. Not yet. The relationship, as described, is functional and genuine, and Thomas is not a man suppressing major doubts, he is a man operating in good faith within what appears to be a good marriage. The retrospective framing is therefore particularly cruel. He is describing a time when everything still seemed fine, and the reader, armed with the knowledge the opening provided, must sit with the awareness that it was never entirely fine. The nod between Elena and Dominic is the closest this section comes to a point of no return, and significantly, Thomas turns away from it. Not out of cowardice, out of preference. This is the psychology of chosen blindness, not the absence of perception but the active management of it. The embedding of Dominic's name in plural company, the transitional mentions, the careful neutrality, these are the behavioral signatures of someone maintaining compartmentalization, and they are almost indistinguishable from ordinary social navigation unless you know to look. Thomas's contentment is not negligence. It is the natural state of a person who has no compelling reason to audit their marriage. The lesson embedded in this section is not that he should have looked harder. It is that concealment performed with sufficient care can survive inside genuine love. Elena said, "I need to tell you something about our wedding day." And then she stopped. She sat at our kitchen table, the one we'd argued about for 3 weekends, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on her own hands, and she stopped. The kind of stop that isn't theatrical hesitation. The kind that comes when a person is genuinely trying to locate the exact word that will cause the least damage and understanding for the first time that no such word exists. I waited. Hendrix, our cat, also a Hendrix, we'd named him after discovering the coincidence and finding it too good to resist, was sitting on the kitchen counter behind Elena's shoulder, observing the scene with total composure. On the day of the wedding, Elena said. During cocktail hour. She stopped again. Dominic was there, I said. It wasn't a question. I said it because it had been sitting at the edge of my mind since she'd said wedding day, assembling itself from the accumulated residue of 3 years of managed half-attention. She looked up at me. Yes, she said. He was a guest. He was a guest, she confirmed. He came with Priya. I remembered Priya. A pleasant, loud-laughing woman who'd been at the top table dinner the night before and had danced aggressively and well at the reception. I had no memory of Dominic at the wedding at all, which was, I supposed, the point. Tell me, I said. She told me. The version she gave me that night was partial, not dishonestly partial, I came to believe, but partial in the way that the first telling of something very difficult is always partial. She told me that she and Dominic had a history, not a long history, not something that had survived into our relationship intact, but that before she and I had become serious, in the early period of our relationship, there had been something between them. An affair is probably too grand a word for what she described, something more provisional, more ambiguous. 2 people who worked together, who were attracted to each other, who had been together briefly and inconclusively, and who had both separately decided that the friendship mattered more than the complication. She had told me about previous relationships in the general terms that people tell each other in the early stages of knowing each other. She had not told me about Dominic specifically, because she'd assessed it as too small and too finished to constitute relevant history. I understood this logic. I had not told her about every provisional encounter either. But at the wedding, during cocktail hour, Dominic had sought her out in the garden. She had told me this in a tone that was not accusatory. She was not casting him as a villain in a story where she had no agency. She had sought him out too, or at minimum had followed willingly when he gestured toward the garden, away from the noise and the champagne and the 112 witnesses. What happened? I asked. She looked at her hands again. He told me he'd made a mistake. Not pursuing us. Not being honest about what he felt. On our wedding day. Yes. The specific absurdity of this timing settled into the room. And? I said. And she stopped. Started again. I told him he was wrong. That I was exactly where I wanted to be. That this conversation shouldn't be happening. But, I said. But I kissed him. She said this quietly and quickly, like a person pulling a bandage off. I kissed him. Or we, I don't know how to assign the grammar of it. It happened. It was very brief. I pulled back and I left the garden and I went back inside and I found you. I thought about this. I was aware of my own breathing, its strange regulation, the automatic body managing itself while the rest of me processed. Did anything else happen? No. Immediately, no hesitation. You're certain? I'm certain. I got up and went to the window. The canal was dark outside, the orange reflections of the street lamps breaking on the water. I stood there for a long time. The Marchetti dinner, I said. What happened there? She hesitated. And in the hesitation, I felt something sharpen. The colleague, I said. Lily. She sent you the message tonight. He told Thomas at the Marchetti dinner. What does that mean? Elena was quiet. Did Dominic attend the Marchetti dinner? I asked. Yes, she said. The Marchetti dinner was an industry event, architectural practices, developers, civic design people. Elena had attended the previous years and mentioned it as a very dull but professionally necessary evening. I had not attended. I had no reason to. What did he tell people at the Marchetti dinner? She looked up at me again with an expression that combined guilt and something I would identify later as relief, the relief of a person who is finally done managing a weight. I don't know exactly, she said. I think he told someone that we'd had a moment at the wedding. And that word had been getting around, quietly, in professional circles. And that Lily heard it and assumed I knew you knew and sent the message. A moment at the wedding. 3 years of word getting around, quietly, in professional circles. I thought about the people at Elena's firm who had known this story while I had not. I thought about Priya, who had been at the wedding, who had come with Dominic, who laughed loudly and danced well. I wondered what Priya knew. Does Dominic still? I started. No, she said. He's married. He married someone last year. I've barely spoken to him in 2 years. I turned around and looked at her across the kitchen. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She was quiet for long enough that I started to think she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, because I was ashamed. And because I was afraid. And because I had decided it was something I needed to carry myself, because I was the one who'd done it. I'm your husband, I said. I know, she said. You've been carrying it for 3 years. Yes. And I didn't know. No. I sat back down at the table. Hendrix had relocated to the top of the refrigerator and was looking down at us with the detached authority of a household god. I need to know if there was anything else, I said. Not just the wedding. I need to know if, in the 3 years we've been married, there has been anything else. She met my eyes. No. Has anything happened with Dominic since the wedding? No. Nothing. You promise me this. I promise you this. I looked at her face for a long time. I was looking for the thing I'd looked for every time I'd suspected something and talked myself out of suspecting it, the crack in the surface, the managed expression, the careful neutrality. I didn't find it. What I found was just her face, raw and exhausted and frightened. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "Okay?" "I need some time to think," I said. "I need a few days. I'm not leaving. I'm not making any decisions tonight. But I need you to not talk to me about this again until I'm ready." She nodded. "And I need you to tell me everything," I said. "Not tonight. When I ask. Everything, in whatever order it comes. No managed version." "Okay," she said. "Even if you think it'll make it worse." "Even then," she said. We went to bed. We did not touch. In the morning I made coffee and she made toast and we did not talk about any of it, and I drove to school and taught 3 classes about the causes of the First World War and came home and made dinner and we ate it. And I thought. Thomas's emotional regulation in this section is remarkable, and revealing. Where another man might rage, or flee, or break down, Thomas becomes meticulously procedural. He asks the precise questions in the precise order. He names the grammar of what happened. He identifies the point at which the Marchetti dinner connects to the message. This is not emotional absence, it is emotional containment, the behavior of someone who has been trained, professionally and personally, to process information before responding to it. The historian's reflex: gather the primary sources before drawing conclusions. But the cost of this containment is visible in the small details: the window, the canal, the orange reflections, the moments where he turns away from her so that his face doesn't have to be read. The key emotional revelation in this section is the 3-year gap. Elena did not tell him for 3 years, not because she didn't love him, but because she had made a private decision about what he needed to know in order to preserve the marriage. This is a form of unilateral protection, the belief that you can manage someone else's pain by keeping its source secret. It is also a form of control. By deciding what Thomas knew, Elena controlled the shape of his reality. The irony is that the secret was discovered not through Thomas's investigation but through a misdirected text, pure accident. The very professionalism of Elena's concealment, sustained for 3 years, was undone in a moment by someone else's inattention. I did not investigate. This is the part of the story that surprises people when I tell it, the part where the expected narrative machinery, the surveillance, the cross-referenced evidence, the discovered receipts, simply doesn't arrive. Because the honest truth is that I believed Elena. I believed her in the way you believe someone when the face they show you in the hardest moment of your shared life contains nothing that resembles performance. What I did instead was think. I took 3 days of that, while Elena and I lived in the flat with careful courtesy, navigating the kitchen and the bathroom and the canal-lit evenings with the elaborate, precise consideration of 2 people who are trying not to say anything irreversible. We ate dinner. We slept in the same bed. We said good morning and good night and almost nothing in between. She did not push. I am still grateful for that. On the first day I thought about the wedding. I went through my memory of it, which is a strange, luminous, fragmentary thing, the way all high-emotion days are, and I tried to locate Dominic in it. I found almost nothing. The one image I could retrieve was a man I'd exchanged 2 brief words with at the bar, whom I had catalogued and then not thought about again. He'd said something complimentary about the venue. I'd said thank you and meant it and moved on. Meanwhile, in the garden, my wife had been kissing him. The garden was a beautiful garden. I remembered it specifically: the old roses, the stone wall, the light. I remembered Elena appearing from the direction of it, early in cocktail hour, and coming to find me, and taking my arm and saying something warm in my ear. I had pulled her closer. I had thought, she is beautiful. I have married the right person. The timeline fit. She had come from the garden. She had kissed him in the garden minutes before and then come to find me and taken my arm. I sat with this for a long time. On the second day I thought about Dominic. I looked him up, not with any investigative intent, just to have a complete picture. LinkedIn gave me a clean professional history, the same firm where he and Elena had overlapped, then a move to a larger practice, then, recently, a directorship at a civic design consultancy. The photograph showed the man from the August garden party, careful, considered, good-looking in an unshowy way. His profile listed him as married. I looked at the photograph for a while and then I closed the tab. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I called Priya. I had her number from the wedding contact list, which we'd kept in a shared document, a relic of the planning process. I called her without preamble or invented pretext, which was either brave or reckless depending on how you look at it. "Thomas," she said, and her voice had a quality I recognized from Elena's voice during the confession, the quality of a person who has been expecting a call and is not sure whether the relief of it arriving outweighs the dread. "You were at the wedding," I said. "You came with Dominic." A pause. "Yes." "Did you know what happened in the garden?" A longer pause. "Not until after. He told me on the way home." "And you didn't tell Elena you'd found out?" "I thought it was her business to manage." "I told her, eventually. Maybe a year later. I told her she needed to tell you. But she didn't." "No." Priya's voice was quiet. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I genuinely am. What exactly did he tell you?" She gave me her version, which aligned with Elena's almost precisely: the confession, the brief kiss, Elena pulling back, Elena returning to the reception. No more than 2 minutes, Priya thought, based on how quickly Elena had reappeared. She added something Elena had not. Dominic had been, in Priya's assessment, genuinely in love with Elena, not in the casual, claiming ownership way of someone who simply can't let go, but in the more complicated way of a man who had made a clear-eyed choice to step back from something he wanted and then found himself standing at a wedding altar adjacent to a question he'd never properly answered. He was trying to release it, Priya said. I think he thought if he said it out loud, to her, at the point of absolute closure, he could let it go. "At my wedding," I said. "I know," Priya said. The timing was inexcusable. "He knows that." I thanked her and ended the call. The consistency between Priya's account and Elena's was, in a way, the evidence I hadn't known I was looking for. The stories aligned not because they'd been coordinated, Priya and Elena had barely spoken in a year, but because they were true. There was still the question of the Marchetti dinner. I had not yet asked Elena for the full account of what Dominic had said there, to whom, and how long the story had been circulating in the architectural community. This bothered me, not because it changed the fundamental facts, but because it meant there were people who had known something about my marriage that I had not known. Colleagues. Acquaintances. People at industry events who had smiled at me and filed this information away. On the third day I called my oldest friend, Marcus, not Marcus from Diane's husband, a different Marcus, a school friend who had stood beside me at the wedding and knew me well enough not to ask polite questions. I called him and said, "I need to talk." He came over that evening, while Elena was at a site visit. We sat at the dining table, the one we'd argued about, and I told him the whole thing. Marcus, who is not a patient man, listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you believe her?" "Yes," I said. "All of it?" "All of it." "Then what's the question?" he said. "The question," I said, "is whether believing her is enough." He considered this with appropriate seriousness. "That's not a question I can answer," he said. "I know," I said. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who isn't her." He stayed for 2 hours. We talked about other things. He left and I sat at the table alone in the specific quiet of a flat that belongs to 2 people when only one of them is in it. Elena came home at 9. She put her bag down in the hallway. She came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. "I'm ready to talk," I said. She sat down. The striking absence of investigation in this section, the point where the genre machinery is expected to engage and instead stays quiet, represents the story's most psychologically honest choice. Thomas does not surveil. He thinks. He calls two people not to gather ammunition but to achieve coherence. The alternative scenario worth exploring here is the one where Elena had told him on their wedding night, or the day after, or the week after. Would the marriage have survived that honesty? Arguably yes, perhaps more intact than it survived 3 years of concealment. The initial betrayal, a brief kiss, self-terminated, on a day of high emotional pressure, is something that might have been survivable as an immediate disclosure, a human failure confessed and addressed at its source. Instead, it became a managed secret that colonized 3 years of shared life. By the time Priya's insight arrives, that Dominic was trying to achieve closure, not to take something, it reframes the garden scene without excusing it. He was not predatory. He was someone who had never properly mourned a thing he'd given up, and who chose catastrophically wrong moment and method to mourn it. That reframing matters to Thomas. It matters to the audience. But it cannot change the 3 years Elena spent deciding he didn't need to know. That decision, repeated every day for 3 years, is ultimately more damaging than the kiss itself. She sat down. I had prepared, in some loose sense, for this conversation, had arranged it mentally over 3 days, identifying what I needed to understand and in what order. But the moment she sat down across from me, the preparation felt thin and academic. She was just Elena. She was wearing the jacket she wore to site visits, the one with the deep pockets. Her hair was down. She looked like herself. "Tell me about the Marchetti dinner," I said. She told me. The previous year's dinner, 12 months ago, not recent at all, had included both Dominic and several mutual professional acquaintances, including someone named Jerome who worked at a practice that overlapped with both their networks. Dominic had been drinking and Jerome had made a remark about Elena that Dominic had found. She searched for the word, triggering wasn't right, provocative wasn't right. He'd found it unsettling. And he'd said, to Jerome and one other person present, something along the lines of, "Elena and I have a history. Wedding day and everything." "And this spread," I said. "Apparently." She looked at her hands. I didn't know he'd said it until Lily texted me. Lily heard it from Jerome's wife at a drinks thing last week. "A year," I said. "This has been circulating for a year." "I think so. I think it stayed fairly contained." "I don't think it's," she stopped. "I don't think it's common knowledge. But people know. Some people." "Yes." I sat with this. The social dimension of it, the external witnesses, the professional circles, the story that had been moving through rooms I had never entered, added a particular humiliation that I hadn't fully prepared for. It wasn't just that I hadn't known. It was that not knowing had happened in front of an audience. "Were you ever going to tell me?" I asked. "Before tonight?" "Ever?" She held my gaze. "Yes," she said. "I had been working toward it. I didn't know when or how. But I knew I couldn't, I knew I didn't want to spend the rest of our marriage carrying it." "When you say working toward it?" "I mean I'd been in therapy for the past 7 months. Partly because of this. Partly because of other things I needed to understand about myself." She said this without drama, as a statement of fact. I hadn't known she was in therapy. "Why didn't you tell me that either?" I said. "Because the therapy was about this," she said. "And I wasn't ready to tell you about this." The recursion of this, the secret protecting itself with other secrets, settled into the room like a piece of furniture that was going to be very heavy to move. "What other things?" I said. "That you needed to understand about yourself." She took a breath. "Whether I made the right choice," she said. "Not about Dominic. About everything. About who I am and who I want to be and whether I've been living the life I wanted or the life that made sense on paper." The words landed with the specific weight of words that have clearly been thought about very carefully for a long time. And? I said. And I have. I've been living the life I want. With you. She paused. I had to work through a lot of noise to get back to that, but I got back to it. Why was there noise? Because I'm not a straightforward person, she said. I feel things in complicated ways and I'm not always honest about it, with myself or with anyone else. I thought I'd resolved something with Dominic long before the wedding, and I hadn't fully resolved it, and when he came to me in the garden I understood that the incompleteness was mine, not just his. We were both unfinished. And I should have walked away from the garden and I didn't. Why didn't you? She looked at me. Because there was a part of me that wanted the finality of that moment even though it was the worst possible context for it. Because saying goodbye properly to something felt like it mattered, even though the way I did it was wrong. I'm not proud of any of this. I was quiet for a long time. Did you love him? I said. Not in the way I love you. She didn't hesitate. In a different way. In the way you can care about someone and be attracted to someone and share something specific with them without it being the main story. He told Priya he'd been in love with you. She looked at the table. I know. I think that was probably true for him. For me it was. She found the word. Incomplete. Something that was never fully formed and therefore never fully finished. And now? Now it's finished, she said. It finished the moment I walked back into the reception and found you. But you didn't tell me that for 3 years, I said. No. No qualification. That was wrong. I made a decision I didn't have the right to make. I decided what you needed to know about your own marriage. That was a form of control that I convinced myself was protection, and it wasn't. It was me managing my own fear. She looked up. I'm sorry, Thomas. Not performatively. Not because the text forced my hand. I'm sorry because it was wrong and I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway for 3 years. I breathed. The table between us was very solid. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the canal reflected nothing because the night was cloudy and the water was dark. I don't know what we are right now, I said. I don't know if I can come back from this. I don't know what I need from you. I know, she said. But I don't want to make a decision tonight, I said. I made that decision 3 days ago and I'm keeping it. Okay. Tell me one more thing, I said. Whatever you need. Why Dominic? Why, of everyone in that church, of all the people we'd invited to witness that day, why him? She was quiet. And then she said, because he was the thing I hadn't put down. And I hadn't put him down because I'd never looked at why I was carrying him. I hadn't looked because looking was harder than carrying. And I didn't look because I was afraid of what I'd find. And what did you find? I said. In therapy. When you finally looked. That I was afraid, she said. Of commitment. Of permanence. Not of you specifically. Of the finality of fully choosing. I was afraid of being completely in. She paused. And that I am. Completely in. That the fear was about me, not about us. The kitchen held this. Okay, I said. Okay? I need to sleep, I said. And then I need some time. And then I need to figure out if what you just told me is something we can build on or something we can't. We went to bed. This night she placed her hand on my arm, careful, not presumptuous, the touch of someone asking a question rather than making a claim. I didn't move away from it. I didn't move toward it either. I lay in the dark and I thought about the garden I had never seen. The old roses. The stone wall. The light. And then I thought about her, walking back inside, finding me, taking my arm. And then I thought about 3 years of Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings and dinners at a table we'd argued about, and all the things that had been real in those 3 years, and whether the reality of them was conditional on what I now knew or not. I didn't sleep for a long time. But eventually I did. Elena's confession in this section is a model of a particular psychological type, the self-aware person who nonetheless fails, not from ignorance but from the gap between understanding and action. She knows, even as she stands in the garden, that what she is doing is wrong. She does it anyway, because the needed answers, the need for resolution, for properly grieving an unfinished thing, is more immediate in that moment than the abstract wrongness. This is not sociopathy. It is the very human capacity to know better and do worse. What the therapy revelation introduces is a reframing of the entire narrative. Elena's 3 years of silence were not simply cowardice or selfishness, they were, from her own account, a symptom of the same pattern that drove her into the garden in the first place, the avoidance of looking at difficult things directly. She managed the wedding day kiss the same way she managed the unresolved feelings for Dominic, by carrying the weight herself rather than confronting the source. Thomas's questions, methodical, fair, exhausting in their precision, function not as interrogation but as archaeology. He is excavating the actual shape of what happened, piece by piece, so that he can make a genuine decision rather than a reactive one. His final question, why Dominic, is the most important one, and her answer is the most honest thing. She says, she was carrying something she hadn't looked at because looking was harder than carrying. This is not the psychology of a faithless person. It is the psychology of a person who had not yet done the interior work that commitment requires. We went to couples therapy. This is not the ending people expect when I tell this story, and I understand why. The expected endings are two: the marriage collapses dramatically, or it is quietly resumed. The idea that a marriage can be taken apart and rebuilt, piece by piece, in the deliberate artificial light of a therapy room, that this process can be honest and painful and ultimately worthwhile, does not fit cleanly into either category. But that is what happened. The therapist's name was Dr. Adeyemi, a careful, warm, extremely patient woman of about 50 who had the quality, rare in anyone, of making silence feel productive rather than punitive. We saw her every 2 weeks for 14 months. We did not have to explain everything from the beginning. Elena had been seeing her individually, and Dr. Adeyemi had, with Elena's consent, been given the outline before we arrived together for the first session. In those sessions I said things I had not known I needed to say. About the 3 years. About the particular humiliation of the professional circles. About the wedding photograph on my mother's wall and what it had become in my mind since the Tuesday in October when everything changed. About the way I had looked at Elena in that kitchen with the text message fresh in the air between us and found, beneath my anger, a bedrock of love that I had not known was that durable. Elena said things too. About the fear of permanence. About the pattern of carrying things alone. About the decision she'd made to manage my reality and how that decision had been, in its way, a failure of respect, the assumption that I could not handle a truth she herself had barely been able to handle. We argued in those sessions. We cried, occasionally. We sat in silence while Dr. Adeyemi waited with the patience of a person who understands that silence is frequently when the real work happens. What I came to understand, across those 14 months, was something that I had intellectually known but had not felt with any force, that the marriage I had believed I was in had been a slightly different marriage from the one that actually existed. Not worse, necessarily. Just not entirely known to me. And that the marriage we were building now, in the sessions, in the careful conversations at home, in the gradual, unsentimental reconstruction of trust, was one I knew more completely. It had been tested in ways the first version had not. It contained information the first version had lacked. There were hard months. There was a period in the second year, post-therapy, when the anger arrived, delayed, as it often is, and I was not easy to live with. I would find myself in rooms, looking at things, thinking about the garden. I would look at Elena laughing at something on the television and think, she was laughing like that in the lobby of a hotel and I was home with the cat. These thoughts were not fair. They were also not untrue. I had to learn to hold both of those things simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds. Elena, to her credit, absorbed the delayed anger without capitulating to it. She didn't perform guilt, there was no ongoing sackcloth, no reflexive apologizing every time I was cold. She was steady and honest and present, and when I was unfair, she said so, calmly, and when I was fair, she acknowledged it, and this consistency was, I came to realize, the thing that made rebuilding possible. She was not trying to win back my approval. She was trying to be, for the first time without concealment, the person she actually was. We went to couples therapy. This is not the ending people expect when I tell this story, and I understand why. The expected endings are two: the marriage collapses dramatically, or it is quietly resumed. The idea that a marriage can be taken apart and rebuilt, piece by piece, in the deliberate artificial light of a therapy room, that this process can be honest and painful and ultimately worthwhile, does not fit cleanly into either category. But that is what happened. The therapist's name was Dr. Adeyemi, a careful, warm, extremely patient woman of about 50 who had the quality, rare in anyone, of making silence feel productive rather than punitive. We saw her every 2 weeks for 14 months. We did not have to explain everything from the beginning. Elena had been seeing her individually, and Dr. Adeyemi had, with Elena's consent, been given the outline before we arrived together for the first session. In those sessions I said things I had not known I needed to say. About the 3 years. About the particular humiliation of the professional circles. About the wedding photograph on my mother's wall and what it had become in my mind since the Tuesday in October when everything changed. About the way I had looked at Elena in that kitchen with the text message fresh in the air between us and found, beneath my anger, a bedrock of love that I had not known was that durable. Elena said things too. About the fear of permanence. About the pattern of carrying things alone. About the decision she'd made to manage my reality and how that decision had been, in its way, a failure of respect, the assumption that I could not handle a truth she herself had barely been able to handle. We argued in those sessions. We cried, occasionally. We sat in silence while Dr. Adeyemi waited with the patience of a person who understands that silence is frequently when the real work happens. What I came to understand, across those 14 months, was something that I had intellectually known but had not felt with any force, that the marriage I had believed I was in had been a slightly different marriage from the one that actually existed. Not worse, necessarily. Just not entirely known to me. And that the marriage we were building now, in the sessions, in the careful conversations at home, in the gradual, unsentimental reconstruction of trust, was one I knew more completely. It had been tested in ways the first version had not. It contained information the first version had lacked. There were hard months. There was a period in the second year, post-therapy, when the anger arrived, delayed, as it often is, and I was not easy to live with. I would find myself in rooms, looking at things, thinking about the garden. I would look at Elena laughing at something on the television and think, she was laughing like that in the lobby of a hotel and I was home with the cat. These thoughts were not fair. They were also not untrue. I had to learn to hold both of those things simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds. Elena, to her credit, absorbed the delayed anger without capitulating to it. She didn't perform guilt, there was no ongoing sackcloth, no reflexive apologizing every time I was cold. She was steady and honest and present, and when I was unfair, she said so, calmly, and when I was fair, she acknowledged it, and this consistency was, I came to realize, the thing that made rebuilding possible. She was not trying to win back my approval. She was trying to be, for the first time without concealment, the person she actually was. I had to learn to trust that person. That was the hardest thing. Not because she was untrustworthy, she was, I believe, genuinely changed by the process of confronting what she'd done, but because trust, once it has been broken in a specific way, has to be rebuilt from a different material. It can't be reconstituted as the original. What you build instead is sturdier and less innocent, and that is not necessarily a worse thing. Marcus came by one evening, early in the second year, and we sat with drinks in the kitchen the way we used to, and he asked me how I was. Really how I was. I thought about it honestly before answering. Complicated, I said. Better than I was. Still working on some things. But, complicated in a way that doesn't feel like damage anymore. More like process. He nodded. He's good at nodding, Marcus. You forgave her, he said. I'm forgiving her, I said. Present tense. It's not a moment. It's a practice. He accepted this without comment, which was the right response. I thought, often, during those 2 years, about the photograph on my mother's wall. The one she won't take down. My face in that image, open, unguarded, radiantly certain, had become, in my mind, a record of a moment before I knew the full story. And for a long time that realization had made the image painful. But eventually, gradually, non-dramatically, in the way that most real changes happen, I came to see it differently. That man in the photograph was not deceived, exactly. He was simply at the beginning. He was at the start of a thing he didn't yet know the full shape of, the way everyone who stands at an altar is at the start of a thing they don't know the full shape of. The certainty in his face was real. The love was real. The life that followed was real, including its most painful part. My mother keeps the photograph up because she loves me, and because she took it on a day that mattered, and because she is not the kind of woman who revises her affections based on subsequent events. I've come to agree with her. Elena and I are still married. We are, at present, in the process of adopting, a long, administrative, quietly hopeful process that requires more paperwork than I had imagined possible and produces, at intervals, sudden intense clarity about what we are doing and why. On the evenings when the paperwork is particularly dense, we sit at the dining table, the one we argued about, and I make tea and she spreads the documents across the surface and we work through them together with the focused, collaborative attention of two people who have agreed to keep choosing each other. The table is still wrong for the space. It still suits us exactly. I am 35 now. I teach history to 16-year-olds who find it irrelevant until the moment it suddenly isn't. I tell them that events which seem inevitable in retrospect were not inevitable at all. I tell them that at every point in history, different choices were available. I tell them that the people who lived through those events were not characters in a story, they were people, full of contradictions and fears and blind spots and unexpected capacities for grace. This remains true. I know it in a way I did not know it at 29, standing at an altar in a navy suit, certain in every bone. It's different knowledge. It's more expensive. But it's mine. At the core of this story are two people with unmet emotional needs who express those needs in entirely different ways, and the collision of those different expressions is what created the crisis. Thomas needed to be fully known by his wife. Elena needed permission to be imperfect, to be complicated, to be someone for whom commitment came with difficulty rather than ease. Neither of these needs was articulated during the 6.5 years before the wedding. Both were carried in private, assumed to be either unimportant or too difficult to name. Elena's unmet need, to reckon honestly with her fear of permanent choosing, drove her into the garden on the worst possible day and kept her silent for 3 years afterward. The therapy was not a corrective for the affair, it was the long overdue reckoning with the need itself. She had been carrying Dominic not because she loved him more than Thomas, but because he represented the unlived alternative, the road not taken, that she had never properly acknowledged or grieved. Until she looked directly at that, it would always retain its particular pull. Thomas's unmet need, to be trusted with the difficult truth of his wife's interior life, was never quite named but was present throughout. His belief in the marriage was genuine and total, and part of what the betrayal cost him was the knowledge that his wife had judged him incapable of receiving the full story of who she was. This is the wound beneath the wound, not the kiss in the garden, but the 3 years in which she decided, daily, that he could not be trusted with it. The resolution the story arrives at is not a restoration of the original marriage. It is the construction of a different one, harder, more honestly known, built on the specific foundation of having survived a thing that could have destroyed it. Whether this constitutes forgiveness in any formal sense is a question the story wisely leaves open. What it offers instead is something more true, the image of two people sitting together under the light of their kitchen, working through paperwork, choosing each other in the quiet, unromantic, persistent way that love, real love, not the kind in photographs, actually looks. The table is wrong for the space. It suits them exactly. That tension, between what should be and what is, between the life that looked right on paper and the life that turned out to be the one worth living, is the emotional truth at the heart of everything.